Hello, this is Dr. James Camp at Lee College in Baytown, Texas, and this is my introduction to connective tissues. There are some properties that define connective tissues, but the problem with defining connective tissues is that every single rule seems to have an exception. For example, most connective tissues exhibit low cellularity, that is, less than 50% of the tissue is made up of cells, often much less than 50%. But there's an except, okay? Adipose tissue, when you look at it under a microscope, is pretty much entirely adipose cells surrounded by a very small amount of reticular fibers and an occasional, blood capillary. Reticular tissue, when you look at it under a microscope, it looks like a kind of grapevine of reticular fibers covered with cells. So greater than 50% certainly of that tissue is taken up by cells. You'll learn about these types of connective tissues in my next presentation, the connective tissue family tree presentation. So if you're feeling a little confused by this, I wasn't sure which thing to introduce first, the properties or the individual tissues. So we're going with the properties first, but you will learn about each of these tissues in a minute. Connective tissues are mostly made of extracellular matrix. Okay, that is the stuff that is in and around, or in between and around the cells that makes the structure of a structural tissue. Again, the exceptions to this are adipose tissue and reticular tissue, where you have to kind of look hard to find the extracellular matrix when you're looking at these under a microscope. Most connective tissues have an abundant blood supply, and in fact, connective tissues are wrapped around and inside muscle and nerve tissues to be their blood supply, and a connective tissue bottom layer, basal layer, basement membrane, is always found right under any epithelial tissue, any epithelial membrane as its blood supply. So most connective tissues have a very abundant blood supply. An exception to this is cartilage tissues, which have none. There is blood supply in the cartilage perichondrium membrane, but in the tissue itself, in the cartilage itself, there is no blood supply. How do cartilage cells get fed is an interesting question and still sort of an open question in biology. The best answer we think we have is that every time you move a joint that has cartilage, you're sort of squishing the cartilage in the same way that you squish a sponge, and that pushes some water out and then sucks fresh water in, and so that provides a modest but steady nutrient supply to your cartilage tissues. Most connective tissues form solid connections or support weight in some way, except, well, blood and lymph are fluid tissues, so they obviously are not going to form solid connections or support any weight. They connect in a different way. As blood and lymph circulate through the body, they carry things from one place to another, and that's a different sort of connection, I suppose. Adipose and reticular tissues are far from solid. They're more in the category of filling space than in the category of forming connections or supporting weight. Most connective tissues serve a secondary purpose. Their primary purpose is their connective role, I suppose. But most carry or store important nutrients, minerals, or even cells. Adipose tissue, fat tissue, obviously stores nutrients, stores spare calories that your body has. Bone tissue obviously stores calcium and phosphorus as minerals. And reticular tissues are there for holding on to important cells. So the reticular tissue in a lymph node holds on to important lymphocytes, for example. There are plenty of exceptions to this, though. All of the dense connective tissues, things that form tendons and ligaments and blood vessel walls and things like that, do not store nutrients. And cartilages, as far as we know, have no nutrient storing uh, or mineral storing capability. In fact, if a cartilage starts to store minerals, if it becomes calcified, that's a pathological state. That's a problem for the cartilage. Finally, most connective tissues are found around or in between, that is, connecting other tissues. And this is probably the one property of connective tissues that I couldn't think of an easy except for. Most of the time, if you find a connective tissue, it's not isolated by itself. It's found around or in between other tissues. Even tendons and ligaments, which are a solid piece of connective tissue, their whole purpose in life is to connect a bone to a bone or a muscle to a bone or something like that. Okay, so let's talk then about what connective tissues are made of. First off, I want to talk about the cells that make them up. There are a couple of standard types. Mesenchymal stem cells. All connective tissues arise from a tissue layer in the fetus or the embryo called the mesenchyme. And so mesenchymal stem cells give rise to all the different connective tissue cell types. There are a handful of mesenchymal stem cells still around in your body as an adult, just in case you need tissue repair, but they're very, very rare. Mast cells hang around in connective tissues to alert the immune system and begin the inflammation process, which is something we won't talk about until A&P2, but it's important to know that they're there. A plethora of unique cell types then exist in different types of connective tissues. If you're a fibrous tissue, like a tendon or a ligament, or even like the kind of randomly fibrous tissue of the dermis or the tissue forming a skull suture, you're going to have fibroblasts. These are not called site cells. Most of these cells are going to end with site. These are blast cells because their job is to divide and produce fibers to actively build tissues in the case of connective tissue damage. Connective tissues have a limited ability to self-repair, but they can, in most cases, self-repair through the action of these fibroblasts. Adipocytes exist in adipose tissue. Obviously, they store fat. Parenchymal cells or parenchymal cells exist in reticular tissues. That's just a broad catch-all category for functional cells of various types. There's reticular tissue in the liver that holds hepatocytes and reticular tissue in the lymph nodes that holds lymphocytes and various other sorts of these. Osteoblasts, osteoclasts, and osteocytes exist in bone tissue. You see the common root osteo there. Blasts build, clasts take apart, and osteocytes maintain. And you'll find all three types in and around any healthy bone. Chondroblasts, on the other hand, build cartilage and then turn into chondrocytes to maintain it. So there are no chondroblasts hanging around a mature cartilage. The problem with this is that makes cartilage very difficult to repair. Chondrocytes have to somehow be induced to become chondroblasts to rebuild the cartilage around them, which is a very difficult thing to do. Lymphocytes exist in lymph and also in blood. And erythrocytes, thrombocytes, and leukocytes are found in the blood. Erythrocytes, red blood cells, by far the most common cells in blood, give blood its rich crimson color. Thrombocytes, also known as platelets, help in the blood clotting process, and leukocytes, the white blood cells, are immune cells that circulate in the blood. Okay, but as we said, most connective tissues are not mostly made of cells. They are mostly made of extracellular matrix. And this extracellular matrix falls into two major categories: protein fibers and ground substance. Protein fibers, you have collagen, which stains pink, though I will color it red here. Collagen fibers are this triple helix of the collagen protein that's a horrible drawing, but they weave around each other in much the same way that three strands of a steel cable wind around each other to hold up a suspension bridge or something like that. And in fact, I call these collagen fibers the steel cables of the protein world because, like steel cables in real life, they are excellent in tension. If you pull on them, they're very, very strong, but poor in compression. So a tendon, as long as it's being in tension between its muscle and the bone it pulls on, is great. As soon as you stop putting tension on it, it just buckles. Okay. Elastic fibers are sometimes called the rubber bands of the protein world, and they, in their relaxed state, they look sort of like this. They have a randomly squiggly shape. If you pull on the ends of these, you can imagine what would happen. If I pulled on this end and I pulled on this end, I would straighten the protein out, and that would create quite a bit of stretch. But because of a fundamental physical property called entropy, these proteins prefer to be in their disorderly, randomly jumbled shape, so they will always snap back to elastic fibers. They'll always snap back to their elastic shape, to their randomly squiggly shape. So elastic fibers are used when a tissue needs to be able to stretch and snap back. One example is arteries that connect to the heart. Because of the huge amount of blood pressure that is put on them, they need to stretch every time the heart beats and then snap back to their normal shape. Another excellent example is the tissue in and around the air sacs of the lungs, which need to expand to bring in air every time you breathe in, and then snap back to their normal size to push that air back out. Finally, there are reticular fibers, which I refer to as jungle gyms for cells to hang out on. These are a particular type of collagen fiber. They're often found in kind of branched shapes that look sort of like a grapevine when you put cells on them, and they will always be seen in the body with an abundance of cells connected to them. Okay. Ground substance, on the other hand, not as consistent as the protein fibers. Different components are in it to meet different needs. What unites all ground substance is that it looks relatively like it's fading into the background on most tissue slides. If you look at a tissue that's been turned into a microscope slide and stained, the ground substance will either look sort of clear or very faintly colored. There are glycosaminoglycans, which are soft, flexible, mostly giant carbohydrate fibers that stand some amount of compression because they act like a gel. Okay, if you can imagine putting compression on your toothpaste, you get the same sort of idea. It's not going to bear a lot of weight, but it will not immediately collapse either. Type 2 collagen is found in cartilage, and unlike the steel cable collagen fibers, this is a randomly woven collagen that remains flexible but is able to bear some weight. Apatite, which is also known as calcium phosphate crystals, is found in bone and teeth. And if you've ever experienced bone or teeth, you know that this is not flexible, but it can bear a lot of compressive force. Normally we would call that weight, but of course your teeth don't really bear weight. They bear the compressive force of chewing, biting into food. And finally, there is the ground substance known as plasma, which is found only in blood and is completely liquid. Plasma is found in blood. It is completely liquid, so it does not bear any weight at all, but it does its job excellently well, which is to flow around the body, carrying things from point A to point B. Okay, so that concludes my brief tour of the connective tissue properties and what makes up a connective tissue. Next up is another presentation on this same YouTube channel that I think is called the Connective Tissue Family Tree. And that will explain the 12 types of connective tissues, how they look under the microscope, what their properties are, and where you might find them. All right, happy studying, and I'll see you around.